Welcome back, listeners, to another exciting episode of the BSB Podcast. Today we're bringing you another episode from deep in our vault. However, before we head on down to Hadestown, like, follow, and subscribe to us on all social media platforms at bsb.insider. And spoiler warning, if you haven't seen the North American touring production of Hadestown, pause this video and return once you have. Thanks again for joining us and enjoy the show. Thank you so much for joining us, Ryan. How are you doing today?
Of course. Thanks for having me. I'm doing well. Excited to talk about this great show that we saw.
Yeah, so this was your first time seeing it, correct?
It was, and it was my first time with anything Hadestown pretty much. I've seen some clips of some stuff coming from New York on TikTok, but I had never listened to the album all the way through or seen anything on the show before. So I was coming into this with a very fresh pair of eyes.
There's just something nice about having a fresh pair of eyes when you're seeing a show. I do like sometimes going to a show without knowing anything about it, which was very similar to how I experienced Hadestown when I went and saw it in New York back in 2021. I knew nothing about it. I didn't even know that I knew that it was a modern retelling of a Greek tale, but I had no clue as to which tale it was retelling, what was going on. So it was definitely a very unique perspective. And I have a different outlook of the show now, having seen the tour, than I have of the Broadway show. RJ, have you seen the show before? I'm almost positive you probably have as an usher, but I gotta check just to make sure.
Yeah. I saw it from the fourth floor while ushering people. So when you do that 5 or 6 times, you do catch a majority of the show. But yes, I do believe that it was prior to the restaging.
Okay.
So
yes,
it was different.
Yes, which I just recently learned is that when it went from equity to not equity, they did change the set, which is why I was telling Ryan at the show, I was like, when I saw it on Broadway, there's a much more elaborate set that did not make the cut for this non-equity tour. So it definitely changes a lot. Well, maybe not so much, but Ryan, how much did you know? Let's take a step back. How familiar were you with Greek mythology as a whole? Were you a Greek mythology kid growing up?
Oh, absolutely. I was obsessed with the Percy Jackson series as a kid. And I would go to the library and pick up the huge books that had all the myths in it and read it a lot as a kid. So when it came to the original story, I was very familiar.
Sure.
I thought that the modern take on it was really interesting. And from the first notes, I was like, okay, so it's got a very New Orleans, Louisiana vibe to it, which is a cool adaptation because I think there's a lot there's a lot of crossover between Louisiana, New Orleans type culture and Greek culture in a sense. So I thought that was a really interesting pair.
Yeah, I think you have a point there. RJ, were you also a Greek mythology kid?
No. I remember learning about it. I remember being that's kind of bizarre.
Sure.
But I never sought it out.
Okay. Were either one of you familiar with the Orpheus and Eurydice story? Because I remember knowing this story, but never remembering the name. So, as much as I heard these names going to the show, it never actually connected until I saw it playing out. I was like, oh, I do know this story.
It's been years since I've read it, but it's the quintessential Greek tragedy, with how it ends. They 90% of their stories are those tragic, hit you in the heart type things at the end. So yeah, I was pretty familiar with it. Yeah.
How about for you, RJ? Again, you said you didn't really know the stories or mythology so well.
Yeah, and I think I lean away from tragedies. So that is I'm if the world is dark enough, I don't need to be reading more darkness. So for sure no. But yeah, that's a double-edged sword. we can.
I was gonna say, says the guy who wanted to go to the World Trade Center Museum. Shy away.
Arguably, I'll watch every apocalyptic movie and natural disaster situation and human disasters, but Greek tragedy, it's a no-go for me.
Well, it's funny that you say that about the show. We're gonna dive into kind of the story behind this, but like, while this is like a modern retelling of Orpheus and Eurydice's story, there is a post-apocalyptic feel to some of this through this development of Hadestown, and what it represents. And so what I want to do is kind of start at the very beginning with our main man, Hermes. Hermes shows up on the scene and is just the narrator for the show. And it kind of, he's telling the story from like a jazz, like a jazz lounge, telling the story of these two people and how their story is kind of timeless. What about this story stuck out to you, Ryann?
I think for me, ultimately, it's that conversation about like trust and trusting your partner, and how like our inner insecurities can end up like costing us everything that we hold most dear.
Absolutely. How about for you, RJ?
I mean, once again, like something about this, maybe it's this specific tragedy. I'm like, meh.
So you didn't like this?
I mean, it's not it's not my least favorite, and it's not my favorite. Mm-hmm. I think I love everything but the ending is the problem.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's the easiest way to say it.
Up until until it actually takes the tragedy part of it into account.
Right. So basically, I'm saying I don't like the beginning or the ending, because as we know, it's technically this like never-ending cycle. Like that is the idea of the end at the beginning and the beginning at the end. But neither can happen without each other, and the whole thing can't happen, period. So it's all kind of null and void.
I'm glad you brought that up. This is a very cyclical story, which is also told in the story of Persephone and Hades and the cycle that they have, which, as people who have studied and or just love Greek mythology, that's a very well-known story. That's a story of the cycle of spring and the cycle of winter. And the fact that they were able to tie these two stories together into the cycle of what is Hadestown, I thought was very interesting, but I can understand why maybe you didn't like that cycle and like that ending. The ending of the loss, of the grief, the tragedy part of it.
Yeah, and I think the fate, right? We have the fates in there, which maybe that's actually the struggle. Like that there is a third party involved playing playing a strong role in the actual outcome.
Sure. Because it kind of takes away the idea of free will.
Right.
How do you sit with that, Ryann? I know we're hitting with the heavy questions today.
I know. I think one of the most interesting things about like the fates, at least from what I can remember, is that while everything is kind of like predestined, there is still a bit of a choice. Like there's almost still that it can go this way or that way. I think the show very heavily leans into like its fate, that the cycle will just keep repeating. But we see it in a couple of different myths of like, this is what was predestined to happen, and at the last minute, they're able to make a different choice, and that almost changes fate. Because fate is like a string almost. You see it depicted in Hercules, where they're cutting those life strings and stuff, and how they change. So while like the show is that cycle, I think they played on the fates in a really interesting way. Almost as like a second antagonist.
Sure. Because it's interesting, because for the most part through the show, they're almost just an observer, which with a lot of mythology, they're not. They dictate a lot of what happens. But they do kind of, they're like haunting this couple, but they're also kind of just watching Hades and Persephone and what's going on and not intervening in that way, which also maybe also adds to the antagonistic feel of the fates. Is there, so I guess for you, RJ, what part of the middle, you said like you didn't like the beginning, you don't like the end. What works for you of the story?
I mean, it's a love story, right? It's pretty traditional. Aside from it being a tragedy, it's a pretty traditional. Boy falls in love with girl. There's a little bit of a chase. Prove your love to me, blah blah blah. She makes a mistake. He goes to the rescue. So on and so forth. So I mean, it's pretty, the predictability, and just overall the way in which it's told through a modern folklore lens, even though it is, Greek.
Is it? Let me ask you this: does the modern aspects of this story make it more digestible, probably for the general public?
100%.
Okay. Does it make it more digestible for? I guess does it make it more digestible for the two of you?
I think what's really interesting to me is when you go back to the root of like how these tragedies were originally told. Like it was all word of mouth. You would sit around the fire, they would tell you these stories, and that's almost kind of how the whole thing was built. And so I think the show does a really great way of making that digestible, like currently, while keeping that same kind of like true north of like this is somebody sitting there telling you a tale, just like it would have been, thousands of years ago.
Sure. I can definitely see that. Let's talk about the music of this, because I think the music is the most telling part. I think this is the part that people see Hadestown, like has, you see people talking about the music of Hadestown more so than even the story. I feel like this is the thing that kind of percolates through the general public's mind. RJ, I know you're a big music guy. Like, I know music's been like a huge part of your life. You're a singer, you're an actor, you do a little bit of everything. How does this music kind of sit with you? Like, where does this rank in like terms of like show musicality of your favorites and least favorites?
I mean, full transparency, I heard this album years and years ago and I skipped it. Skipped it originally, and then a friend of mine, when we were talking about musicals, she said, this is my jam. And I was like, what do you mean? What do you,
Sure.
How could this possibly be your jam? So then I gave it the benefit of the doubt and I dove back in because of the story and less for the music. All of that to say, the original album for this show was a folk concept album. It was not
really
a musical theater, which I think you can tell by the way in which it's written, right? And even then the premise of the show, like it does have a folky, it's not quite pop, but it's just on the edge. And maybe that's due to like a lot of the guitar and kind of limited band and jazz feel. But that obviously plays into the whole, setting of, New Orleans type Depression era jazz club. But yeah, the original album was a narrative song cycle for the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. And it was basically had like a bunch of guest, like well-known guest vocalists on it to kind of push it to be known. And then it just developed into a full-scale musical. So I can see how that would be a thing. Like I can see how it went from concept album to, okay, we're going to build an entire show around the music, because there really is like minimal dialogue, just song after song. So
along those, first off, I didn't know that it was a concept album like that, but that makes sense. That makes sense for the way you feel, because it is very music intensive. And I think that one of the ways that you could even witness that was when we had our medical emergency in the middle of our show. And they were in the middle of Wait For Me, and they didn't just go back to start the middle of that song, which I've seen some shows like pick up right where they left off. But they did restart the whole song because it moves like musical chapters through a book.
Yeah, and that song specifically is probably the song, ironically, of the show. Like, that is, there was a cult following after the album, and that is one of the songs that is, without it, like, you wouldn't have that show.
That is the one song that I had heard pre going into it.
So you knew none of the other music before going in?
No.
Okay.
No,
so
I had seen some clips online of I think they just kind of switched actors in New York, or in the process of switching actors right now. So I had seen some of the previous set, but it was primarily just of that song.
I feel like that, especially on TikTok and stuff, that song took off with like such velocity. That when I went a few years ago, and granted, it's only been on Broadway. I think they just celebrated 5 years. And somebody can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was 5 years. And so I saw it 4 years ago with the original Broadway cast. And as a shout out to Marty would tell me, the day we went, Eva Noble Doza was actually sick, so I never saw her live. But that's the only song I knew. It's the only one. I don't even know if an album was officially out yet. I can't remember the timeline, but I knew that song. I knew that song from social media. And then I think right around that time too is when you started hearing Down in Hadestown, because I think that's such a low bass song that a lot of, correct me if I'm wrong here, RJ, but it's like a baritone bass song. Either one of those can sing that pretty well, correct?
Which?
The way down in Hadestown.
I mean, yeah, probably baritone.
Okay.
All right. Yeah.
Do you think that's why that one got so big too, though, is because you don't see a lot of baritone-based songs in musicals for people to sing?
Yeah, I mean, usually the lead is a tenor, and in the show you have like a variety, because you have Orpheus, you have Hades, and you have Hermes, and they're all different vocal ranges, so that lends itself to a variety.
Okay. For you, Ryan, then, having experienced this show now from start to finish with the music, where does the music rank for you? Are we talking, is it a waitress, or is it a, I don't know which one you don't like, but
I think it would fall somewhere in the middle for me. Some of the songs seem a little busy because there's so much happening. You've got so many moving parts. You've got the Fates joining in. You've got Eurydice. You've got Orpheus. You've got Hades and Persephone, like kind of all coming together in a lot of the songs. And so some of them felt a little like, I don't want to say like busy, but you know what I mean? Like you're trying to focus in on one thing, and there's so many moving parts. I am much more of a like solo belting type person when it comes, I like to focus on one thing at a time. But yeah, I'd say somewhere in the middle. Like, it wasn't my favorite soundtrack, but it definitely was not my least. Like, I enjoyed the jazz. I enjoyed how it was soulful yet still kind of upbeat.
Absolutely. It's definitely got that jazz vibe. It reminded me of when I was in New Orleans and you go to a jazz club, and that's exactly the vibes that you get from there. But I can also understand why you're saying it's very busy. And I think part of that was the change in the set, which we'll talk about in part 2. But also that there is a lot of movement going on. There's a lot of moving pieces, and the tempo is always changing to some of those songs. Like, it's not always consistent, but also jazz music isn't consistent. Is that a fair assessment, RJ? I know you're more of a musical person here.
I mean, jazz is, it's jazz. Depending on your type of jazz, but repetitive in whatever type that it is. But I think part of the reason that I initially wasn't drawn to it is along the same reasons that Ryan is saying, is there's just a lot, especially when you're only listening to the album and you don't know what's going on stage. Because I mean, I think I was listening to it like during COVID, so obviously I wasn't going to any shows and I hadn't seen it yet, so I had no idea like who was singing what and why. It felt disconjointed. So then to see it on stage, on top of not being super familiar with the album and not being familiar with the production, there is a lot happening. So, agreed.
I do wonder if that's why I enjoyed it more this time than I have in the past, was because the first time I saw it, I think that I was trying to take all of it in as it was happening. And I think I would like to get your opinion on this, Ryan, as well. But like, I feel like that first time, it's very easy to get overwhelmed and swept up into it because there's really not a moment to breathe. And there's really, again, it's not like one of those ones where they stand and sing, you clap, and then they kind of wait and they move on. Like this one is, the show is constantly moving, constantly going. And there's always somebody coming on or off that stage or doing something or moving a piece. And did the story, did you ever have trouble following the story and the music together through Hadestown for your first time?
But I had too much trouble just because I was familiar with the story beforehand. But I will agree with you, like, you'll have one character singing on the right of the stage while an entire scene is playing off on the left. And so that was kind of hard to follow sometimes because you're trying to focus on the person actively singing, but then there's a whole, nonverbal storyline kind of almost happening off to the side behind. So that did feel a little disjointed.
How about for you, RJ?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what you're paying attention to along
Sure.
the same lines. Although I guess, like, I say that, and then I think arguably that might be the case for shows that I've just seen less. Like,
Sure.
The last few that I've seen, I may have only seen once. And so while I'm trying to catch everything, I fully know that I won't. I'm not going to catch everything because there's too much happening for me to catch for the first time. So yeah, I don't know that it's specific to this show. But I will say, like, once again, musically and even choreo wise, it's very tight and it is very fast and it doesn't stop. I mean, I can't even remember. I think we clapped like twice in that whole first act. So it keeps moving, which of course, like, some shows just need to have that pace. But it's like you have to be at 100% the entire time, otherwise you could easily miss something.
I think in that sense, it's very similar to like the first time that I watched Hamilton. Like, it has a very similar feel to that, where like Hamilton is the same way, where it like it's song after song and then it just keeps moving. And I saw a lot of parallels to that in the pacing, I noticed.
Sure. And what's interesting about using that parallel, and I'm going to use a different show as well to make this comparison, but when you talk about Hamilton, I knew the album backwards and front by the time I saw that show the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had no trouble knowing what was going on, and I was so enthralled and enjoyed and just deep in it. But I also knew every word, and I could not imagine going into that show not knowing the music and or the story and just being like, what's happening here? And in fact, when I watched it with my mom when the Pro Shot came out on Disney Plus, she didn't like it because she didn't know half of the things that were being said or what was really truly going on, because there's not a lot of, like, there's a big set, but there's not a lot of pieces to kind of tell the story. It's people singing, telling their story, and you're supposed to know what they're saying, And so I think that when you do have a show that is very like musically inclined, either has to be like you either have to tell the story in songs that slow it down a little bit, or are songs that people are familiar with, or something else has to give. So shows like, I'm thinking of Moulin Rouge, which everybody knows the music pretty much of Moulin Rouge because it's a jukebox musical. So you can do some more heavy story and choreography while you're dancing because people can pay attention to that part of it and not be distracted by the words. But with that, we actually are running out of time. So stay tuned for our second episode in our Hadestown discussion, where we will be covering performances, staging, and the final verdict. Thank you again for joining us here in our box seats. Ryan, thank you for being here, and we're excited to talk to you for part 2. Until next curtain call.